How a Mossad mechanic outsmarted the KGB and saved a prime minister. Wait, before the next operation begins. If this mission already pulled you into the shadows, tell us where you're watching from. To stay inside the next secret, betrayal, or act of justice, subscribe and join the agency. Eyes open, back to the mission. Dove didn't move for 30 seconds. He remained crouched beside the front wheel well of the armored vehicle, his breath controlled, his mind calculating trajectories of consequence. The garage smelled of motor oil and concrete dust, but underneath it all was the faint chemical signature had been trained to recognize in a basement in Herzliya 12 years ago. Czech-manufactured RDX, the same compound that had killed 3 Shin Bet officers in Haifa in 1971, packaged differently now, smaller, more elegant, but unmistakable to a man who'd spent half his life with his hands inside engines and the other half inside secrets. He was 52 years old. His hands were scarred from burns and cuts accumulated across 3 decades of service. His official title was Senior Automotive Technician, Protective Services Division. His unofficial designation was Kidon Adjacent. Not a shooter, not a ghost, but something stranger and more valuable. A man who could hear betrayal in the whisper of a timing belt, who could taste treason in the residue on a spark plug. The Mercedes was scheduled to carry Prime Minister Rabin from the hotel to a security briefing at the Knesset at 7 p.m. the following evening. Standard route, standard protection detail, standard everything, except for the fact that someone had accessed this vehicle 4 days ago during a 20-minute window when the rotation logs showed a gap, 20 minutes that shouldn't have existed, 20 minutes that Dov had spent the last 96 hours trying to understand. He picked up the wrench and set it down on his tool tray with deliberate care. The sound needed to be normal. The garage had cameras, but more importantly, it had patterns, and any deviation from those patterns would alert whoever had orchestrated the gap in the rotation logs that their work had been discovered. Dov stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen cleaner days. He walked to the workbench against the far wall, his gait unhurried, and consulted the maintenance log as he did every night. His handwriting documented oil levels, brake pad thickness, tire pressure, the mundane liturgy of keeping powerful men alive through attention to detail. But his mind was mapping something else entirely. The device wasn't in the engine. Too obvious, too easy to detect during standard sweeps. It wasn't in the passenger compartment. The interior had been stripped and rebuilt twice in the last month after intelligence suggested a potential threat from Palestinian factions. That left the undercarriage, the wheel wells, or the exhaust system. Dov had checked all 3 areas twice already, found nothing, which meant the device was either exceptionally well hidden or hadn't been placed yet. But the chemical signature didn't lie. He'd detected it on the driver's side door handle 3 nights ago. Trace amounts, the kind left by someone who'd handled the compound recently and then touched the vehicle. The same signature had appeared on the fuel cap yesterday. Someone was preparing, testing access. Confirming the schedule. Dov closed the maintenance log and glanced at his watch. 2:51 a.m. In 6 hours, the day shift would arrive. In 16 hours, the Prime Minister would enter this vehicle, and if Dov was right, if the thing he'd spent 4 sleepless nights trying to prove was actually true, then someone in the protective detail, someone with access and authority and the trust of the state, was going to kill Yitzhak Rabin with a bomb nobody would find until it was too late. He couldn't report it yet, not without proof. The chemical traces could be explained away, cross-contamination from security sweeps, paranoia from an aging technician who spent too much time alone with his thoughts and his tools. Dov needed more than whispers and shadows. He needed the device itself or the identity of the person who'd planted it. Or both. He returned to the Mercedes, this time with a different set of tools. Not wrenches and sockets, but the instruments of a deeper investigation. A fiber optic camera no thicker than a pencil, a spectral analyzer that could detect compositional anomalies in metals and plastics, and a small leather notebook that had no business in a government garage, but which Dove had carried for 20 years, a catalog of every suspicious detail, every unexplained modification, every moment when his instincts whispered that something was wrong. The notebook had 17 entries. 16 had saved lives. 1 had failed. He didn't intend for this to be the second failure. Dove slid beneath the chassis, the creeper rolling smoothly across the oil-stained concrete. The underside of an armored Mercedes was a landscape of reinforced steel, blast-resistant plating, and redundant systems designed to keep its occupants alive through ambush, explosion, or concentrated rifle fire. Every bolt had been torqued to specification, every weld had been inspected, every component had been certified by 3 different departments. Except one. Dove's light caught it immediately, a hydraulic line that ran from the brake assembly toward the rear axle. Standard configuration, except this particular line had a junction box that was 7 millimeters thicker than regulation. 7 millimeters. The difference between a safety check that passed and one that should have triggered immediate investigation. He positioned the fiber optic camera and fed it into the junction box through a service port. The screen on his handheld monitor flickered, then resolved into an image that made his pulse spike despite 30 years of training in emotional control. The interior of the junction box had been modified. A secondary chamber had been machined into the housing, invisible from the outside, accessible only through a specific sequence of brake applications. 3 full depressions followed by a half depression held for 4 seconds. The chamber contained approximately 40 grams of RDX, enough to sever the brake line and compromise the hydraulic system, but more importantly, enough to ignite the fuel tank if the shape charge was positioned correctly, which it was. Dove captured 6 images from different angles. The device was sophisticated, Czech or East German manufacture, possibly mid-1970s vintage, which meant KGB supply chains, which meant this wasn't a Palestinian operation or a lone actor with access to black market explosives. This was a state-sponsored assassination attempt with technical precision and operational planning that suggested months of preparation. He withdrew the camera and lay motionless beneath the chassis, his mind racing through implications. The KGB had been running operations against Israeli targets for decades, but direct attempts on the Prime Minister were rare and carried enormous political risk. This level of sophistication suggested approval from very high levels in Moscow, possibly the first chief directorate, possibly even the chairman himself. But how had they recruited someone with access to this garage? The security protocols were ironclad. Every member of the protective detail had been vetted, monitored, and re-vetted. Background checks went back 3 generations. Financial records were audited quarterly. Personal relationships were documented and assessed for compromise potential. Someone had passed all those checks and remained clean enough to operate undetected. Dove slid out from under the Mercedes and sat up slowly. His knees protested. 52 years of crouching in tight spaces had left their mark. He checked his watch again. 3:14 a.m. The device was designed to detonate remotely, which meant the operator needed line of sight or at least close proximity to the motorcade route. Standard procedure would be to sweep the route for observers, but if the operator was part of the security detail, they'd already be in position, already trusted, already invisible. He needed to identify the asset, not just find the bomb. Anyone could find a bomb with enough time and the right equipment. He needed to find the person who'd placed it, because that person would simply try again if this attempt was thwarted without exposure. Dove stood and walked to the small office adjacent to the garage bay, a glorified closet with a desk, a file cabinet, and a telephone that connected to a secure switchboard in the basement of a building 7 blocks away. The office had no windows. The walls were reinforced concrete. The door locked from the inside with a deadbolt that Dove had installed himself. He lifted the phone receiver and dialed a number he'd memorized but never written down. 3 rings. A click. Silence. "Ezra," Dove said quietly, "I need 20 minutes, scrambled, and I need you to pull personnel files without flagging the request." The silence stretched for 5 seconds. Then, "Location?" Same as always. 15 minutes. Come alone. The line went dead. Dove replaced the receiver and locked the office door. He walked back to the Mercedes and began the process of documenting everything with the kind of meticulous detail that would hold up under interrogation or investigation. Photographs from 12 angles, spectral analysis readings, measurements accurate to the millimeter. He worked quickly but without rushing, his hands steady despite the adrenaline beginning to thread through his bloodstream. At 3:42 a.m., he left the garage through the service exit, climbed 2 flights of stairs to street level, and walked 3 blocks east into the old city. The streets were empty except for a few cats and the occasional taxi making its way toward the central station. Jerusalem at night was a different city, quieter, older, full of stones that had witnessed 30 centuries of conspiracy and violence. Dove turned down a narrow alley between 2 buildings that had stood since Ottoman times and descended another set of stairs into a subterranean space that officially didn't exist. A room carved from bedrock sometime in the 1950s, used for meetings that needed to happen outside the architecture of official channels. Ezra was already there, sitting at a metal table under a bare light bulb, smoking a cigarette despite having quit 7 years ago. He was 61, gray-haired, wearing a cardigan that looked like it had survived both the Yom Kippur War and several marriages. He'd been Dove's handler for 15 years, back when Dove still did field work, back when the word mechanic had meant something very different than it did now. "Show me," Ezra said, without preamble. Dove placed the camera on the table and brought up the saved images. Ezra studied them for 3 minutes without speaking, his expression revealing nothing except the slight tightening around his eyes that Dove had learned to recognize as controlled alarm. "Check manufacture," Ezra said finally. "That's Directorate S hardware." Someone called in a favor from Department 8. "How long have they been running this?" Dove asked. "If they're using this kind of hardware, at least 8 months, probably longer. They'd need time to establish the asset, confirm access, develop the operational plan." Ezra lit another cigarette from the first. "You said you need personnel files. Everyone with access to the garage in the last 6 months. Maintenance staff, security detail, administrative personnel. Anyone who could have placed this device or facilitated its placement." Ezra nodded slowly. "That's 47 people. 47 files I have to pull without anyone noticing, which means I have maybe 6 hours before someone asks why I'm reading personnel folders at 4 in the morning. I need behavioral anomalies, financial irregularities, anything that suggests recruitment or coercion. And if there's nothing, then we're looking at a sleeper who's been clean for years, someone they recruited before they ever applied for government service." Ezra exhaled smoke toward the stone ceiling. "Do you know how paranoid that sounds? Do you know what happens if I'm wrong versus what happens if I'm right?" They looked at each other across the table, 2 men who'd spent their careers in the margins of official violence, who'd learned that paranoia was just pattern recognition applied to incomplete information. "I'll have the files in 3 hours, Ezra said. "Where do you want to meet?" "The garage. I need to be there when the day shift arrives. I need to see who looks at the Mercedes and who doesn't." "You're assuming they'll tip their hand. I'm assuming they're human. Humans check their work." Ezra stubbed out his cigarette. "What's your containment plan if you identify the asset?" "That depends on who it is. That's not a plan, Dove. That's improvisation. Improvisation is what I do. You handle the files. I'll handle the asset." Ezra stood, collecting the camera. "If this goes wrong, if you're wrong about any of this, they'll pull your clearance and pension you out. You understand that? If I'm right and do nothing, they'll bury Rabin and then spend 10 years trying to figure out how it happened. I understand the math." They climbed the stairs together, emerging into the pre-dawn darkness of the old city. Ezra turned left toward his car. Dove turned right, back toward the hotel, back toward the garage where a device built in Prague was waiting to turn a Tuesday evening into a national catastrophe. The sun was starting to pale the eastern sky by the time Dove returned to his workstation. He made coffee in the small break room, bitter, institutional, kept hot in a carafe that had seen better decades, and reviewed his maintenance schedule for the day. 3 vehicles needed routine service. 2 required pre-departure inspections. 1 was scheduled for armor certification renewal. Normal work, normal routines, the kind of day that looked exactly like every other day, except for the fact that somewhere in the next 8 hours, someone would need to arm the device he'd discovered, and when they did, they'd reveal themselves. At 6:15 a.m., the day shift began to arrive. Rafi came first, 28 years old, former Golani Brigade, 2 years in protective services. He nodded to Dove and headed straight for his locker. Then Avi, 43, career security, 3 kids, mortgage in Mevaseret. Then Gideon, Tal, Yosef. Dove watched them all, watched how they moved through the garage, what they looked at, what they avoided. Gideon spent 2 minutes inspecting a tire on one of the backup vehicles. Normal. Tal checked the fuel levels on 3 cars. Normal. Yosef reviewed the departure schedule and made a phone call. Normal. Everything normal. Everything routine. At 7:30 a.m., Miriam arrived. She was 36, slim, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing the standard protective services uniform. She transferred from the Northern District 8 months ago, came with excellent recommendations, spotless record, fluent in 4 languages. She worked rotations in the garage, coordinating vehicle assignments and maintaining the electronic security logs. She walked past the Mercedes without looking at it. Not a glance, not a pause, nothing that suggested awareness or interest. Which was exactly what made Dove's instincts spike. Everyone looked at the Prime Minister's vehicle. It was human nature. The most important car in the garage, the one that carried the most weight, literal and metaphorical. Security personnel checked it reflexively, even when it wasn't their responsibility, because the alternative to checking was living with the possibility that you'd missed something. Miriam hadn't looked once. Dove watched her settle at her desk in the corner office, watched her boot up her computer and begin reviewing the day's schedule. Her movements were efficient, professional, unremarkable. But the absence of that single glance was a data point, and Dove had learned 3 decades ago that sometimes absence was louder than presence. He needed Ezra's files. He needed to know if Miriam's transfer 8 months ago aligned with anything unusual, any gaps in her history, any unexplained periods that could hide recruitment or training. At 9:17 a.m., his phone rang. The internal line. "Workshop," Dove answered. "Package ready. Usual spot. 30 minutes. Click. Dove finished the brake inspection he'd been performing, legitimately this time, on a backup vehicle that actually needed the work, and signed off on the maintenance log. He told Rafi he needed to requisition parts from the supply depot and left through the main entrance. The usual spot was a cafe 3 blocks from the hotel, the kind of place that served strong coffee and mediocre pastries to tourists and civil servants who needed a break from their respective forms of tedium. Dove ordered black coffee and sat at a table near the back. Ezra arrived 6 minutes later, carrying a leather portfolio that looked exactly like the ones carried by half the lawyers and bureaucrats in Jerusalem. He sat down without ordering anything. 47 files, Ezra said quietly. 46 came back clean. 1 didn't. He slid a folder across the table. Dove opened it. Miriam Kotz. Born in Tel Aviv, 1967. Parents both academics. Father a professor of literature, mother a linguist. Educated at Hebrew University. Applied to Mossad at 23. Rejected for psychological evaluation concerns. Specifically, difficulty with authority structures and tendency toward ideological rigidity. Worked in private security for 6 years. Reapplied to government service at 31, accepted into protective detail after additional screening. Nothing obvious, nothing that screamed recruitment or compromise. But then Dove reached the third page and his coffee went cold in his hand. Miriam had spent 8 months in 1993 studying Russian literature at Moscow State University, exchange program, fully documented. Except the program had been arranged through a cultural foundation that, according to Ezra's notes, had been identified 3 years ago as a KGB front organization used for spotting and assessing potential recruitment targets. She was 26, Dove said, single, fluent in Russian, rejected by Mossad and working private security. Perfect target demographic. It's circumstantial, Ezra replied. The foundation processed hundreds of students. Most of them weren't recruited. But some were. And 8 years later, she transfers into the one assignment that gives her access to the Prime Minister's motorcade vehicles. Ezra leaned back in his chair. Even if you're right, even if Moscow spotted her in 1993 and spent 8 years developing her as a sleeper, you still need proof. You need her touching that device or communicating with her handler or something that holds up under interrogation. I have 14 hours until the motorcade leaves. I don't have time for proof that holds up under interrogation. I need proof that stops an assassination. So what's your play? Dove closed the folder. I'm going to give her an opportunity to arm the device. And when she takes it, I'm going to be there. You're going to wait until she demonstrates hostile intent and then intervene? I'm going to wait until she demonstrates hostile intent and then document it. Once we have her actions on camera, we can roll up the entire network, her handler, her communications protocols, maybe even identify other sleepers they've planted. Ezra's expression was the kind of controlled skepticism that came from 30 years of watching operations go sideways. And if something goes wrong, if she arms the device and you can't stop her, then I defuse it. I've done it before. Not with Czech RDX positioned to ignite a fuel tank. First time for everything. They looked at each other across the table, and Dove saw the calculation happening behind Ezra's eyes, weighing risk against necessity, operational value against human cost. I can't authorize this officially, Ezra. If it goes wrong, you'll be alone. I've always been alone. That's why I'm good at it. Ezra stood. Call me when it's done, or don't call me, and I'll assume you're dead. Always so optimistic. Optimism is for people who don't read casualty reports. Ezra left first. Dove waited 5 minutes, finished his cold coffee, and walked back toward the hotel. The morning was heating up. Jerusalem in late spring. The kind of dry warmth that made the stone buildings glow like they were lit from within. Tourists were starting to feel the streets, cameras and guidebooks, and the peculiar vulnerability of people who didn't know they were walking through a city where every corner had witnessed violence older than their countries. Dove thought about Miriam, 26 years old, studying Pushkin and Dostoevsky in Moscow, probably excited about the opportunity, probably naive about the attention she was drawing from people whose job was to identify useful vulnerabilities. Had they approached her there? Or had they waited, watched her return to Israel, tracked her application to government service, and then activated her years later when she'd forgotten she'd ever been of interest? Either way, she'd said yes at some point. Either ideology or coercion or money or some combination of all three had turned her into an asset willing to kill for Moscow. Dove didn't hate her for it. He'd seen enough compromised officers over the years to know that recruitment was a gradual erosion, not a single moment of betrayal. They started with small requests, information about schedules, copies of unclassified documents, the kind of thing that felt harmless or even patriotic if framed correctly. Then the requests escalated, and by the time the asset understood what they'd become, they were too deep to extract themselves without destroying everything they'd built. But understanding didn't mean mercy, not when the operation involved killing Yitzhak Rabin. He reached the hotel at 10:45 a.m. The garage was busy now. Mechanics and security personnel moving between vehicles, the steady rhythm of preparation and maintenance that kept the machinery of state protection functional. Dove returned to his workstation and began preparing his surveillance equipment. He had a camera small enough to conceal in a toolbox, hardwired to a recorder that could capture 6 hours of footage. He had a radio scanner tuned to the frequencies used by protective detail personnel. He had a set of lockpicks disguised as Allen wrenches because sometimes you needed to get into places that weren't technically your responsibility. And he had the location of the device, which meant he could position himself in a way that put him between Miriam and the Mercedes at the critical moment. At 2 p.m., the garage began to clear out. Lunch rotation, shift changes, the normal ebb and flow of personnel. By 2:30, only 3 people remained: Dove, Rafi, and Miriam. Rafi was performing inventory in the supply room. Miriam was at her desk, reviewing departure schedules. Dove positioned himself at a workbench with clear sight lines to both the Mercedes and Miriam's office. He activated the hidden camera and pretended to be cataloging spark plugs. At 3:17 p.m., Miriam stood up from her desk. She walked toward the restroom, her path taking her past the Mercedes. She didn't stop, didn't pause, didn't look at the vehicle. But as she passed, her right hand brushed against the driver's side door handle, the same door handle where Dove had detected chemical traces. He watched her continue to the restroom, watched her disappear through the door, watched the seconds tick past on his watch: 15, 30, 45. At 1 minute and 12 seconds, she emerged. She walked back toward her desk, same route, same casual pace. And this time, as she passed the Mercedes, she did stop. Just for 2 seconds, just long enough to glance around the garage, confirm that Rafi was still in the supply room and Dove was still at his workbench. Then she crouched beside the driver's side wheel well, exactly where Dove had been crouched 12 hours earlier, and her hand disappeared into the shadows beneath the chassis. The camera captured everything: the angle of her body, the movement of her arm, the small electronic device she removed from her jacket pocket, no bigger than a pager with a single button and a status light. She pressed the button 3 times in quick succession. The status light blinked green. The bomb was armed. Miriam stood smoothly, pocketed the device, and walked back to her desk as if nothing had happened. She sat down and resumed reviewing schedules, her expression completely neutral. Dove remained at his workbench, his hands steady despite the cold certainty now flooding his nervous system. She just armed a bomb to kill the Prime Minister in approximately 4 hours, and she'd done it with the practiced calm of someone who'd trained for this exact sequence of actions. He gave her 5 minutes. Let her settle back into her routine. Let her believe she'd completed her task unobserved. Then he walked toward her office, carrying a clipboard and a pencil, looking like a maintenance supervisor with a scheduling question. "Miriam," he said, keeping his voice casual, "do you have a minute? I need to confirm the departure time for the Knesset run." She looked up from her computer. 7 o'clock, same as always." "Right. And the route is unchanged?" "Unchanged." She smiled slightly. "Are you feeling okay, Dove? You seem distracted today." "Long night, insomnia." "You should try tea. My mother always said tea helps." "I'll keep that in mind." He returned to his workbench. On the surface, the conversation had been completely mundane. Exactly the kind of brief interaction that happened 50 times a day in the garage. But Dove had been watching her eyes during the exchange, and what he'd seen there had confirmed everything. No nervousness, no tells, no micro-expressions that suggested guilt or fear or the weight of having just armed an explosive device. She was cold, professionally trained, the kind of deep-cover asset who could compartmentalize with absolute precision, which meant she was dangerous in ways that went beyond the immediate threat. If Moscow had invested 8 years in developing her, they wouldn't have done so for a single operation. She represented a penetration of Israeli security services that probably extended beyond this garage, beyond protective services, into areas Dove couldn't even begin to map. But right now, that was Ezra's problem. Dove's problem was disarming a bomb and stopping an assassination. At 4:30 p.m., the evening shift began to arrive. More personnel, more movement, the garage filling up with activity as vehicles were prepped for their various assignments. Dove watched Miriam interact with the incoming staff. Professional, friendly, completely normal. At 5:15 p.m., she logged off her computer and retrieved her jacket from the coat rack. "Have a good evening," she said to Rafi as she passed his station. "You too, Miriam." She walked toward the exit, her stride unhurried, and disappeared up the stairs to street level. Dove waited exactly 1 minute. Then he walked to her desk and checked her computer. Logged off, no sessions active, nothing accessible without her password. He checked her drawers. Locked, but the locks were standard government issue, which meant they yielded to his Allen wrench picks in under 20 seconds. Inside, he found the usual office supplies, a spare jacket, and a leather-bound notebook with a phone number written on the inside cover. No area code, no country code, just 9 digits. He memorized the number and locked the drawers again. At 5:45 p.m., the garage was at full staffing. 8 security personnel, 4 mechanics, 2 supervisors. The Mercedes was scheduled for departure in 75 minutes. Standard procedure called for a final security sweep 30 minutes before departure, which meant Dove had 45 minutes to disarm the device without anyone noticing. He collected his tools and a droplight and positioned himself beside the Mercedes. To anyone watching, he was performing a routine pre-departure inspection, checking fluid levels, testing lights, examining the suspension. What he was actually doing was sliding beneath the chassis with his fiber optic camera and his bomb disposal kit, a collection of specialized tools that officially didn't exist in his inventory, but which he'd accumulated over 30 years of finding things that weren't supposed to be found. The device hadn't changed position. Still nestled in its custom-machined chamber, still connected to the brake line, still capable of turning this vehicle into a fireball. But now it was armed. The detonator was active, probably set to trigger via remote signal or possibly through the brake application sequence Dove had identified earlier. Either way, disarming it meant disconnecting the detonator without triggering the failsafe that was almost certainly built into a device this sophisticated. Dove worked slowly, methodically, his hands steady despite the pressure. He isolated the power source first. A button battery, standard and replaceable, which meant the device was designed for long-term deployment. He traced the wiring from the battery to the detonator, mapping the circuit, identifying the points where intervention would render it inert versus the points where intervention would cause immediate detonation. Check engineering. Precise, redundant, designed by people who understood that their work would be examined by experts attempting to defeat it. But Dove had been defeating Soviet bloc devices since before Miriam was born. He'd trained with Kidam technicians who'd studied at the feet of men who'd learned their craft from Nazis and British commandos and Irgun fighters who'd improvised explosives in Jerusalem basements during the Mandate. 3 generations of expertise lived in his scarred hands, and what he knew, what he'd learned through trial and error, and one spectacular failure in 1978 that still gave him nightmares, was that every bomb maker left a signature, a way of thinking about the problem that revealed itself in the architecture of the device. This bomb maker liked redundancy but hated complexity. The circuit was elegant, minimal components, maximum reliability, which meant the failsafe was probably mechanical rather than electronic, probably a pressure switch or tension spring that would complete the circuit if the detonator was removed improperly. Dove probed the housing with a tool thin enough to slip between the detonator and its mounting bracket. He felt the resistance he'd expected, a spring-loaded contact that would close if the detonator was lifted. He worked a wire shim into the gap, creating a temporary bypass that held the spring in place. Then, with painstaking slowness, he lifted the detonator from its mount. The device remained inert. He exhaled for the first time in 40 seconds. The next 5 minutes were spent carefully extracting the RDX charge from the hydraulic line housing and placing it in a containment bag designed to suppress accidental detonation. When he slid out from beneath the Mercedes, the bomb no longer existed as a functional weapon, just components and chemicals that would become evidence in whatever investigation followed. Dove checked his watch, 6:23 p.m., 37 minutes until departure. He packaged the components in a small equipment case that looked exactly like his standard inspection kit and locked it in his personal locker. Then he walked to the phone in the small office and dialed Ezra's number. 2 rings. "Done?" Ezra asked. "Device is neutralized. Asset is identified. I have video documentation and physical evidence. Casualties? None. Witnesses? None. Then we have a problem," Ezra said quietly. Because the asset knows the device was armed. When it doesn't detonate, she'll know it was discovered and disarmed, which means she'll run and will lose any chance of rolling up her network. Dove leaned against the wall, suddenly aware of how tired he was. 4 nights without sleep, 16 hours of sustained stress, and now the peculiar anticlimax that came from preventing something that would never happen. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Nothing yet. Let the motorcade depart as scheduled. Let her see that everything appears normal. We'll have surveillance on her from the moment she leaves her apartment tonight. If she runs, we'll follow. If she tries to contact her handler, we'll intercept. Either way, we'll know more about their network than they think we do. And if she doesn't run? If she's disciplined enough to wait and see if the operation was simply delayed. Then we'll wait too. But eventually, she'll move. They all do." The line went dead. Dove hung up the phone and returned to the garage. The final security sweep was underway. 3 officers with detection equipment moving over every inch of the Mercedes, finding nothing because there was nothing left to find. At 6:55 p.m., the Prime Minister's protection detail arrived. At 6:58 p.m., Robin himself appeared, surrounded by his usual complement of bodyguards, moving with the brisk efficiency of a man who'd spent 50 years in proximity to violence and had learned not to waste time on fear. He paused beside the Mercedes, spoke briefly with the head of his detail, then climbed into the rear seat. The door closed with the solid thunk of German engineering and Israeli paranoia. The engine started. The motorcade pulled out of the garage at exactly 7 p.m., right on schedule, and disappeared into the Jerusalem evening traffic. Dove watched them go. Watched the taillights fade into the city, carrying a man who didn't know how close he'd come to dying, protected by systems and procedures, and one 52-year-old mechanic who'd learned to hear betrayal in the whisper of a timing belt. He returned to his locker and retrieved the equipment case containing the disarmed bomb components. Then he locked up his tools, signed out on the evening roster, and climbed the stairs to street level. The city was beautiful in the late spring evening, the stone buildings golden in the setting sun, the air warm and dry, tourists and residents moving through the streets in the eternal dance of commerce and faith that had defined Jerusalem for 3,000 years. Dove walked toward the old city, toward the cafe where he'd met Ezra that morning, toward the next phase of whatever operation was now unfolding in the invisible spaces between intelligence services. He ordered coffee, waited. Ezra arrived at 8:47 p.m., looking tired in a way that suggested he'd spent the last 2 hours coordinating surveillance teams and drafting operational orders. "She's at home," Ezra said, sitting down without preamble. "Her apartment in Talbia. Lights on, movement inside, phone line active. We have visual and audio coverage. Any communications?" "One phone call, 15 minutes after the motorcade departed. She called her mother in Tel Aviv. They talked about Shabbat dinner plans, nothing operational." "She's waiting to be contacted," Dove said. "Her protocol is probably to remain passive until her handler initiates." "That's our assessment too." Ezra lit a cigarette. which means we wait. Could be hours, could be days. And if it's weeks, then we have other problems. But I don't think it will be. The Russians know the operation failed. Their asset armed the device. The motorcade departed. Nothing happened. They'll want to understand what went wrong. That means contact. They sat in silence for several minutes, drinking coffee, watching the evening foot traffic through the cafe's windows. Finally, Ezra spoke again. "The device you recovered, how sophisticated?" "Very. Czech manufacture, probably mid-70s vintage. Designed for deep placement with minimal detection profile. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. Which means KGB technical services. Which means this operation had authorization from very high levels in Moscow." Ezra exhaled smoke. "They're taking significant political risk running this kind of operation against an Israeli prime minister. The question is why now? What's changed that makes assassination worth the potential blowback?" Dove considered the question. Rabin's been pursuing Oslo, peace negotiations with Arafat. It's controversial domestically, but Moscow usually supports peace processes, stabilizes the region, reduces American influence. Unless they have reasons to want instability, or unless they're being paid by someone who wants Rabin dead. You think this is contracted work? KGB operating as mercenaries? I think we won't know until we interrogate Miriam or her handler. But it's a hypothesis worth considering. They finished their coffee. Ezra's phone rang at 9:23 p.m. A brief conversation, mostly listening, ending with a terse acknowledgement. She just left her apartment, Ezra reported, carrying a small bag, walking north toward the city center. On foot? On foot. We have 4 teams rotating coverage. Where she goes, we go. Dove stood. I'm coming with you. You're a mechanic, not a surveillance officer. I'm a mechanic who just stopped an assassination. I've earned the right to see how this ends. Ezra didn't argue. They left the cafe together and climbed into a nondescript sedan parked 2 blocks away. Ezra drove while monitoring radio traffic from the surveillance teams. Terse updates, street names, movement patterns. She's heading toward Mamilla, Ezra said. Moving with purpose, but not rushing. Checking her surroundings, but not obviously counter-surveillance. They followed at a distance, maintaining position through radio updates rather than direct visual contact. The surveillance teams were professionals, rotating coverage, changing distances, blending into the pedestrian traffic that filled Jerusalem's evening streets. At 9:47 p.m., the radio crackled. Subject entering Café Ramon, taking a table in the back section, ordering coffee. Ezra pulled the sedan into a parking space, moving with purpose, but not rushing. Checking her surroundings, but not obviously counter-surveillance. They followed at a distance, maintaining position through radio updates rather than direct visual contact. The surveillance teams were professionals, rotating coverage, changing distances, blending into the pedestrian traffic that filled Jerusalem's evening streets. At 9:47 p.m., the radio crackled. Subject entering Café Ramon, taking a table in the back section, ordering coffee. Ezra pulled the sedan into a parking space 3 blocks away. She's making contact. This is how they'll do it. Public location, neutral ground, easy exit paths. How long do we wait? As long as it takes. If the handler shows, we get identification and surveillance. If she makes a dead drop, we recover it after she leaves. Either way, we get pieces of the network. They waited. Radio updates came every few minutes. Subject drinking coffee, subject checking her watch, subject remaining seated. At 10:12 p.m., the handler arrived. Middle-aged male, the radio reported. Approximately 55, gray hair, wearing dark jacket. Carrying newspaper. Taking seat adjacent to subject. No obvious contact yet. Ezra's expression tightened. Get me a photograph. Full facial identification. Run it through every database we have. 3 minutes later, Ezra's phone received a text message. A photograph of a man sitting at a cafe table. Newspaper open, coffee cup in front of him. European features, professional bearing. Completely unremarkable except for the fact that he was sitting 3 feet from a compromised Israeli intelligence asset. Ezra forwarded the photo with a priority flag. The response came back in under 10 minutes. Identification confirmed. Viktor Leskov, documented KGB officer, 1st Chief Directorate, stationed in Amman under commercial cover 1989-1995. Known facilitator of Middle East operations. High-value target. They sent a senior officer, Dove said quietly. Either this operation is more important than we thought, or they're worried enough about the failure to send someone with authority to assess damage and make decisions. Or both, Ezra replied. He keyed his radio. All teams, maintain coverage. Subject and contact are priority 1. If they separate, split teams, 2 on each. Authorization for extended surveillance. At 10:28 p.m., Miriam and Victor stood simultaneously. They didn't speak, didn't acknowledge each other, didn't exchange any obvious signal. But they left the cafe together, walking in the same direction, maintaining a spacing of approximately 10 meters. The surveillance teams followed, through Mamilla, toward the old city, down narrow streets that had witnessed centuries of quiet conversations and whispered conspiracies. At 10:41 p.m., they entered a small hotel, the kind of place that catered to religious pilgrims and budget tourists, anonymous and forgettable. They're in the lobby, the radio reported. Subject proceeding to elevator. Contact remaining in lobby reading newspaper. She's going up to a room, Ezra said. He's staying down to provide counter-surveillance. They'll meet after she confirms the room is secure. 10 minutes later, Victor folded his newspaper and walked toward the elevator. Both subjects now on 4th floor. Visual contact lost, no coverage inside hotel. Ezra made a decision. Deploy static surveillance on all exits. I want to know the moment either of them leave. Audio teams, can we get coverage on the 4th floor? Negative. Building is old construction, walls too thick for external penetration. We'd need direct placement to get audio. Then we wait for them to come out. And when they do, we follow Victor back to wherever he's staying. I want his hotel, his contacts, his communications protocols. Everything. They waited again. Jerusalem at night through the windshield, ancient stone and modern electricity, tourists and believers and intelligence officers all moving through the same narrow streets with vastly different purposes. At 11:34 p.m., Victor emerged from the hotel alone. He walked east toward the German colony, moving with the casual pace of someone taking an evening stroll. The surveillance teams shadowed him through 6 blocks, watched him enter another hotel, marginally nicer than the first, the kind of place where a commercial trade representative might stay during a business trip. He's in room 312, Ezra said after receiving updates. I'm authorizing audio coverage. We need to know if he's reporting back to Moscow and what he's telling them. By 2 a.m., the audio team had placed monitoring equipment in the room adjacent to Victor's. By 2:30 a.m., they had captured 3 phone calls, 2 to Amman, 1 to a number in Moscow that intelligence databases identified as a known 1st Chief Directorate switchboard. The calls were brief, cryptic, but clear enough in their implications. The operation had failed. The device had been neutralized. The asset was potentially compromised but maintaining position while the situation was assessed. And then, in the 3rd call, a detail that made Ezra's expression go cold. Secondary option remains viable. Asset 2 is in position. Authorization requested for expedited deployment. Asset 2. There was a second operative. Ezra keyed his radio immediately. All teams, priority alert. We have indication of secondary asset in protective services. Initiate immediate review of all personnel with access to Prime Minister's security detail. Cross-reference against Moscow travel, known KGB recruitment patterns, and any anomalies in background checks. Dove felt the cold certainty returning. Miriam hadn't been alone. Whatever network Moscow had built into Israeli security services included at least one other operative, possibly more, and that operative was apparently ready to execute an alternative assassination plan. How long to identify Asset 2? Dove asked. Depends on how deep they are. Could be hours, could be days. Ezra's jaw was tight. But we have one advantage. Victor thinks we don't know about the second asset. He thinks Miriam's operation failed due to technical malfunction or random discovery, not because we're actively hunting their network. So we use that. We let him think we're blind while we search. Exactly. And we keep full surveillance on Miriam. She might not know about Asset 2 specifically, but she knows the network structure. She might lead us to connections we haven't identified. The night stretched on. Dove and Ezra sat in the sedan, monitoring radio traffic, reviewing personnel files on a tablet computer, searching for the pattern that would reveal the second operative. At 4:17 a.m., one of Ezra's analysts called with a potential identification. Yosef Mizrahi, age 31, transferred to Protective Services 14 months ago from Northern Border Security. Service record is clean, but his transfer coincided with a family emergency. Father hospitalized in Tiberias. Mizrahi requested compassionate transfer to be closer to family. That's a legitimate reason, Ezra said. What makes you flag him? The father's hospitalization was real, but the diagnosis was unusual. A rare neurological condition that requires expensive ongoing treatment. Mizrahi's financial records show he's been paying for specialized care that's not covered by standard health insurance. Total medical bills over the past year exceed 400,000 shekels. And his salary is what? Approximately 120,000 shekels annually. So he has a financial pressure point. Someone could have offered to help with his father's medical bills in exchange for cooperation. That's the hypothesis. And there's one more thing. Mizrahi spent 3 weeks in Cyprus last year. Told his supervisors it was a vacation. But we checked hotel records. He stayed in Nicosia at a hotel known to be used by Soviet commercial representatives. Ezra closed his eyes briefly. That's him. Asset 2 is Yosef Mizrahi. Do we have current location? He's off duty tonight. Home address is in Neve Yaakov. We can have a team there in 15 minutes. No, don't approach him yet. If we move too early and he realizes he's been identified, he'll abort whatever secondary plan they have and will lose the opportunity to disrupt it completely. Ezra thought for a moment. What's Mizrahi's duty rotation? He's scheduled for motorcade security tomorrow evening. Prime Minister is attending a... And there's one more thing. Mizrahi spent 3 weeks in Cyprus last year. Told his supervisors it was a vacation. But we checked hotel records. He stayed in Nicosia at a hotel known to be used by Soviet commercial representatives. Ezra closed his eyes briefly. That's him. Asset 2 is Yosef Mizrahi. Do we have current location? He's off duty tonight. Home address is in Neve Yaakov. We can have a team there in 15 minutes. No, don't approach him yet. If we move too early and he realizes he's been identified, he'll abort whatever secondary plan they have and will lose the opportunity to disrupt it completely. Ezra thought for a moment. What's Mizrahi's duty rotation? He's scheduled for motorcade security tomorrow evening. Prime Minister is attending a dinner at the Knesset, 7 p.m. departure from the residence. So if they're running a secondary option with expedited deployment, tomorrow evening is probably the window. Mizrahi would have access to the vehicles, opportunity to place a device, and cover to operate without drawing suspicion. Dove felt the pieces fitting together. Do we arrest him now or let him make his move? If we arrest him now, we get one asset but lose the network. If we let him proceed under controlled conditions, if we watch him place the device and then intervene before it can cause harm, We get operational intelligence about their methods and potentially identify additional network members. That's high risk. Everything is high risk. But stopping two assets is good. Dismantling their entire Middle East network is better. They returned to headquarters as dawn was breaking over Jerusalem, the city emerging from darkness into another day of ancient conflicts and modern conspiracies. Ezra convened a briefing with senior protective services commanders, intelligence analysts, and technical specialists. Dove sat in the corner, an anomaly in a room full of officers and officials, but nobody questioned his presence. He'd earned his place at the table. The plan they developed over the next 6 hours was elegant in its simplicity. Allow Mizrahi to access the Prime Minister's vehicle, monitor him with concealed surveillance, document his actions, and intervene at the moment before point of no return. Additional security measures would be deployed covertly. Backup vehicles, extended security perimeter, medical teams on standby. The Prime Minister would be briefed personally about the threat and the operational plan to neutralize it. At 2 p.m., Dove returned to the garage beneath the King David Hotel. Everything looked exactly as it had the previous day. Mechanics performing routine maintenance, security personnel coordinating schedules, the steady rhythm of protecting powerful people from those who wanted them dead. Yosef Mizrahi arrived at 3:30 p.m. for his shift. He was young, professional, moved with the easy confidence of someone who believed he was unobserved. He checked in with his supervisor, reviewed the evening departure schedule, and began his routine pre-deployment inspection of the motorcar vehicles. Dove watched from his workstation, pretending to inventory supplies while actually tracking Mizrahi's movement through the garage. The hidden cameras Ezra's team had installed overnight would capture everything, but Dove wanted his own eyes on the situation, his own assessment of what was about to happen. At 4:45 p.m., Mizrahi approached the Prime Minister's Mercedes. He performed a standard visual inspection, checking tires, lights, exterior condition. Normal procedure, nothing suspicious. Then, at 4:52 p.m., he crouched beside the driver's side wheel well, the exact same location where Miriam had armed her device 24 hours earlier. His hand disappeared into the shadows beneath the chassis, emerged holding a small device identical to the one Miriam had used. He pressed the button sequence, 3 quick presses, green status light. Except this time, the device he'd just armed wasn't actually connected to a bomb, because Dove had spent 3 hours that morning discreetly accessing every possible hiding spot in the Mercedes undercarriage and ensuring that any device placed there would find only empty mounting points and disabled detonation circuits. Mizrahi didn't know that. He stood, pocketed the arming device, and returned to his normal duties, satisfied that he'd completed his mission. At 5:15 p.m., Ezra's teams moved in. 6 officers, all in protective services uniforms, all with legitimate reason to be in the garage. They approached Mizrahi calmly, professionally, without drama. "Yosef Mizrahi, you need to come with us for a security review." To his credit, Mizrahi didn't run. He looked confused, then concerned, then carefully neutral. "Is there a problem?" "Just routine. Please come with us." They escorted him to a secure interrogation facility beneath the Knesset. Simultaneously, other teams except this time, the device he just armed wasn't actually connected to a bomb, because Dove had spent 3 hours that morning discreetly accessing every possible hiding spot in the Mercedes undercarriage and ensuring that any device placed there would find only empty mounting points and disabled detonation circuits. Mizrahi didn't know that. He stood, pocketed the arming device, and returned to his normal duties, satisfied that he'd completed his mission. At 5:15 p.m., Ezra's teams moved in. 6 officers, all in protective services uniforms, all with legitimate reason to be in the garage. They approached Mizrahi calmly, professionally, without drama. "Yosef Mizrahi, you need to come with us for a security review." To his credit, Mizrahi didn't run. He looked confused, then concerned, then carefully neutral. "Is there a problem?" "Just routine. Please come with us." They escorted him to a secure interrogation facility beneath the Knesset. Simultaneously, other teams arrested Miriam at her apartment, detained Viktor Leskov at his hotel, and executed search warrants on 3 additional addresses identified through overnight analysis of communications intercepts. By midnight, the network was dismantled. Miriam and Yosef had both provided initial statements confirming KGB recruitment and operational control. Viktor Leskov, facing decades in an Israeli prison, had begun negotiating information for lenience. The details he provided mapped a larger picture: a Moscow-directed operation with funding from sources inside Syria designed to destabilize Israeli politics during the sensitive Oslo negotiation period. Asset 2 had been a contingency plan all along, insurance against the possibility that Asset 1 might be discovered or compromised. The KGB had learned from decades of operational failures that redundancy was the key to successful political violence. They'd been wrong about one thing, though. They'd assumed that Israeli security services would be looking for Palestinian militants or domestic extremists, not for deep-cover Soviet sleepers recruited years earlier and activated with surgical precision. They hadn't accounted for a 52-year-old mechanic who could hear betrayal in the whisper of a timing belt. 3 weeks later, Dov received a summons to a nondescript office building in Tel Aviv. He took a bus from Jerusalem, arrived at the specified address, and was escorted to a conference room on the 4th floor. Waiting for him were 3 men he didn't recognize and 1 he did. Ezra, looking tired but satisfied, smoking a cigarette by the window. Dov Ashkenazi, one of the unknown men said. He was 60-something, silver-haired, wearing a suit that suggested authority. "I'm told you prevented an assassination and dismantled a foreign intelligence network using nothing but a wrench and extreme paranoia." "The wrench helped," Dov replied, "but mostly it was listening. You understand that what you did, the operational decisions you made, the risks you accepted, those were technically outside your authority and responsibility. I understand that if I'd reported everything through channels, the Prime Minister would be dead and we wouldn't have rolled up the network." The silver-haired man smiled slightly. "That's correct. Which is why you're not here for discipline. You're here for recognition." He slid a folder across the table. "This is a commendation for exceptional service in the protection of state security. It's classified, of course. You can't tell anyone about it, can't frame it on your wall, can't use it to explain to your family why you sometimes come home at 4 in the morning smelling like motor oil and fear." "So it's worthless," Dov said. "No, it's proof that what you did mattered. And more than that, it's authorization for me to offer you a position that matches your actual capabilities rather than your official job description." He opened the folder. Inside was a job offer: Technical Director, Counterintelligence Operations. A position that would take Dov out of the garage and into the classified world of hunting foreign intelligence networks on Israeli soil. "We need people who can think like you did," the silver-haired man continued. "People who understand that the real threats don't announce themselves with obvious patterns. They hide in maintenance logs and transfer requests and timing belts that whisper secrets to anyone patient enough to listen." Dov looked at the offer, looked at Ezra, who gave him the slight nod that meant this was legitimate, this was real. "I'm 52 years old," Dov said. "I have arthritis in my hands and my knees protest every time I crouch beside a car. I'm not field operative material anymore." "We don't need field operatives. We need someone who can teach younger officers to see what you see, hear what you hear. We need your paranoia weaponized on behalf of national security." Dov thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. Then he signed the paperwork. That evening, he returned to the garage beneath the King David Hotel for the last time. He packed his personal tools, signed out on the roster, and said goodbye to Rafi and Avi and the others who'd worked beside him for years without ever knowing what he really did, what he really saw, what he really prevented. The Mercedes was still there, sitting in its designated bay, looking exactly like it had 3 weeks ago, except for the fact that it no longer carried a bomb designed to kill the man who rode in its back seat. Dove ran his hand along the hood one final time. The metal was cool, perfect. German engineering and Israeli paranoia combined into a vehicle that would carry its occupants safely through whatever dangers waited in the Jerusalem streets. "Take care of it," he told Rafi. "It's a good car. It deserves someone who listens to what it's trying to say." Rafi looked confused but nodded. "Sure, Dov, whatever you say." Dov walked up the stairs to street level, emerging into the Jerusalem evening. The city golden in the setting sun. Tourists and believers moving through streets that had witnessed 3,000 years of violence and survival. He thought about Yosef Mizrahi, sitting in a prison cell, probably wondering how it had all gone wrong. About Miriam, facing decades of imprisonment for choosing ideology over loyalty. About Viktor Leskov, negotiating his future with intelligence services that would never fully trust him again. And he thought about Yitzhak Rabin, who continued attending meetings and dinners and security briefings, protected by systems and procedures and people who operate in the shadows so that others could stand in the light. The work wasn't glamorous. Nobody would write songs about a mechanic who heard things others missed. Nobody would build monuments to paranoia and attention to detail. But the Prime Minister was alive. The network was dismantled. And somewhere in Moscow, in the offices of the first Chief Directorate, analysts were trying to understand how their carefully constructed operation had failed. How 2 assets, years of planning, sophisticated equipment, and professional execution had been defeated by a man with a wrench and the patience to listen to what engines whispered in the darkness. Dov caught a bus heading north. As Jerusalem disappeared behind him, he opened the folder containing his new position's briefing materials. The first page was a list of current threats. 12 active foreign intelligence operations targeting Israeli security services, ranging from Iranian recruitment efforts to Chinese technical espionage to suspected Russian penetrations of military procurement. He'd have work to do tomorrow. New threats to hunt. New patterns to identify, new officers to train in the art of seeing what was hidden in plain sight. But tonight, he was just a 52-year-old man riding a bus through the Israeli evening, tired and satisfied, carrying secrets that would never be told and victories that would never be celebrated beyond the walls of classified briefing rooms. It was enough. It had always been enough. The code had been kept. Loyalty, duty, silence, truth. And in the margins of history, in the footnotes that nobody would read, a mechanic had outsmarted the KGB and saved a prime minister with nothing but a wrench and the knowledge that sometimes the quietest sounds carry the loudest warnings.